Equanimity has become a buzzword, not just for spiritually inclined people, but also general population as well. And I think it's something that often gets unintentionally or even intentionally conflated with ethical relativism. So I'm going to deal with that conflation in this video, as well as my own experience of equanimity and how I've come to work with it over time. But first, I want to acknowledge that one of the reasons we have such a prominence of equanimity in the English language these days is due to the influence of Buddhism. And Buddhism considers equanimity to be one of the four brahmaviharas. So we have loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And in those first three brahmaviharas, we can really kind of feel the heart resonance, the sense of feeling that comes through ideas like compassion, sympathetic joy, and loving kindness. And then we get to equanimity, and somehow equanimity comes to be viewed as this sort of transcendental, cold, impartial perspective. Something that isn't really heart-centered at all. But that's not my experience of equanimity. It is, however, a very common engagement of the term equanimity that results in folks perhaps washing their hands of ethical matters on the human level, or seeing transcendence as preferable to being involved in a human experience. And it's understandable, perhaps, that equanimity encourages this, because it does certainly have an element of impartiality to it, but it's not a cold transcendence impartiality in my experience. I think if we can understand equanimity as the absence of aversion and craving, and, you know, when I say the absence of, it may even be the absence of aversion to aversion and craving. You know, there's these kind of meta levels to which we can relate to our mind and the phenomena that arises within it. But if we do see it in this way, as kind of the absence of these two things, it isn't necessarily transcendent or above or cold. It's just simply not buying into the stories that something should or should not be in our lives. So for me, equanimity feels really like a capacity to be with what is. Even if what is a very difficult experience, which I might be responding to with emotions of sadness, anger, grief, shock. Or if it's a really enjoyable experience and, you know, joy is arising, or even ecstasy, happiness, well-being. So yes, there is an element of impartiality, but it still allows for emotion. And I think this is where folks tend to either police themselves or police other people in the spiritual community unknowingly. Because if we see within us an emotional responsiveness, we might assume that that is in opposition to equanimity, that somehow equanimity can't coexist with, say, anger or frustration or confusion. We might think that equanimity can't coexist with enjoyment, pleasure, and happiness. That's just simply not true. In my experience, it's possible to both deeply feel our emotions and to have a clear responsiveness to what's arising, at the same time as being fully with what is, in a state of understanding that this is really happening. And I'm not going to argue against the fact that it is happening. I may not like it, I may not enjoy it, but the equanimous part of me is able to acknowledge the wholeness of reality without pushing it away or pulling it in. That's the craving and aversion. And even, as I said before, in response to craving and aversion, we can have a type of equanimity to the fact that that might be present as well, in being able to observe ourselves in a state of craving or in a state of aversion and not deny or try and move away from the fact that that is a part of our current experience. So, in this way, equanimity starts to look a little bit more akin to the other three brahmaviharas in its embracing quality. You know, equanimity can be a heart level experience rather than a cold mentalization or transcendence of the world, because it has this way of enfolding all of reality within its awareness and allowing for our experience to be, regardless of the level of charge which our emotions might be feeling. So when we see ourselves or others respond to the idea of equanimity as this kind of transcendence or coldness, some of the results of that interpretation can be an ethical relativism, even an extreme ethical relativism, where perhaps we're watching the news and there's a war going on and we can see the tragic, painful, indescribably profound suffering that human beings are experiencing because of that. And we might use the excuse of equanimity to kind of dissociate from the human ethical conundrum that such things put us in. So we're looking at someone in the street being harmed by another person, and we kind of like step out of ourselves and step out of the experience and step out of compassion and shared beingness with the person being harmed in order to say, well, you know, this is just reality unfolding. This is just the nature of things, or the world is an illusion, and I need to be balanced in my response to all things. So balance, yes. Equanimity in its heart-centered space, yes. And I believe, at least, that if we can tap into the true essence of equanimity, it actually makes us more responsive to suffering in the world. We see this modeled through people like Buddha and Jesus, and many of the really good examples that we have of spiritual leadership. I know that there's plenty of terrible examples out there as well. But that folks that we see to be genuinely living the path that they preach, uh, they tend to be people who are extremely compassionate and extremely responsive to injustice in the world. They'll happily say, this person shouldn't be treated this way. I mean, there's so many examples of Buddha and Jesus both standing up for folks who, at the time in that cultural context, were being treated inequitably. They made statements in whom they welcomed into their discipleship and whom they chose to teach and imbue and empower with their spiritual transmission. The choices they made about that displayed their ethical stance in relationship to the society that they were living in. So equanimity certainly doesn't mean ethical relativism. It doesn't mean that we say, well, there's no good or bad, full stop, and whatever is unfolding is, I don't need to intervene in any way because there's no good or bad ultimately. And so perhaps from, unified consciousness, we can see that there's these polarities arising in unified consciousness, that the Great One Being is expressing itself through divine difference. And some of those differences are so extreme that we might even put them into categories like good and evil. So we can see that, and we can acknowledge that, and we can understand the connectivity of all beings through unified consciousness, and simultaneously hold the fact that we are one of those expressions of unified consciousness in its divine diversity. And our experience is individual, and it's meaningful on a human level. And so, in the same way that we might say, okay, I'm equanimous about the fact that there is harm being done here, we can also say, well, I'm equanimous about the fact that being able to step in and perhaps prevent some of that harm is also a part of the expression of divine diversity. It goes both ways. However, folks who get into this sort of transcendent mindset about spirituality tend to only see the perspective of like stepping back and being like, well, there's no good or bad, rather than recognizing that their own capacity to take action is equally an expression of unified consciousness. So, it's quite difficult to kind of talk around these things because it's hard to kind of understand something so paradoxical. And I think this is why folks tend to move into this space of like total transcendence, where they're just dissociating from the human experience and seeing everything as illusion, or why people might be so embedded and embroiled in their spiritual identity as someone who has to solve the world's problems or liberate everyone. And it's actually the kind of balancing of these paradoxical two polarities, which enables us to take genuine, really effective action in the world. That by understanding the shared beingness of all things, that I am both good and bad, that others are both good and bad, that all of us are simultaneously neither, we hold that level of feeling and understanding of our experience. And at the same time, we're very present to the human emotions that arise, the capacity of the human to take action in the world and to make decisions about their life and how they want to express their humanity. And we bring those two things together in such a way that we are absolutely taking action. Because why on earth would we be put in this human experience if we weren't intended to actually engage with it, right? So we embrace that human experience, we step into it, but we take action not from our own woundedness. Like, this is the gift of equanimity, essentially, is that it allows us to see, acknowledge, honor any woundedness or emotional attachment or aversion that arises, but without allowing that to drive the show. And so when we hold a true essential equanimity alongside those other three beautiful expressions of consciousness, and I'm just temporarily speaking from the Buddhist perspective because I think it has had such a huge impact on contemporary Western thinking around equanimity. So equanimity alongside compassion, alongside love and kindness, alongside sympathetic joy, allows us to step into the world to make choices about how we contribute to the shared field, about what kind of contribution we want to make to the shared field, and to do that from a place where we're not being directed by our own selfish desires. I think it's really helpful to reflect on things like transcendental thinking from that perspective of like, how is this actually potentially serving my own selfish desires? Because if I'm faced with injustice, as Herod did in the Bible, if I wash my hands of that, I get to be free of any of the discomfort that might arise, any of the complexity that might arise with being involved in that situation. And that complexity, that discomfort, is a part of the human experience. It's why we're here. It's the friction which helps us to recognize our shared beingness. And so, you know, to kind of like transcend these situations or these ideas, it's a self-serving thing. However, it can also be incredibly self-serving to step into that situation from a place of the opposite direction of like, I'm here to save people, or I am here to liberate spiritually the people who are so in their illusion, right? So equanimity for me has really become about the driving force of what I choose to do in the world. And that it's possible for me to experience equanimity to not be driven by my emotional response, although I have the emotional response still. That's really important, because it's all information. It's all attunement to the different levels of reality that are unfolding. So I'm not being driven by emotionality in a way that inspires me to act from clinging or aversion. I'm recognizing my clinging, my aversion, I'm recognizing my emotion, and I'm taking action from that place beyond that, which is made up of these brahmaviharas, which is made up of, it is consciousness itself. You know, this is my understanding at least, and I'm not, you know, I've certainly done some looking at Buddhist philosophy, but I'm more in the kind of tantric yogic realm. So, you know, if I get this wrong, please, I bow to folks who are better knowledged than I. You know, the Brahma Viharas, as I understand them, we can perhaps invite them more into our being through things like meditation or through just general awareness in our life. But they are actually, as I understand it, the nature of that base awareness or base consciousness itself. You know, that when we allow ourselves to dissolve back into that great oneness, which is, whether we see it from the yogic perspective as a oneness that is something, or we see it from the Buddhist perspective as a oneness that is emptiness, that unified field is made up of compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So it's not like we need to become that. And it's not like we're pretending that. But if we get out of the way, and getting out of the way is stepping out of our own craving and aversion, then these qualities naturally imbue the beingness that is already present. And we naturally are able to respond to life and the world from those qualities, rather than from the selfish, really, the craving and aversion, right? That is the nature of the human ego. But we don't make that ego bad. You know, we don't fall into this sense of polarity. I can recognize suffering in the world, and I can choose to speak up about it or take action in relation to it if it's in my immediate vicinity, without seeing anyone as bad, without kind of condemning another to be less than I am, because we're all the same thing. It's really interesting because I, you know, have always felt very strongly about equity issues, and time again, I step into these spaces as a spiritually inclined person where equity is questioned. It's questioned. in ways that really surprise me. It surprises me that someone with such a deeply contemplative spiritual heart might really ethically wash their hands of situations. And, for better or worse, I just don't feel like that's it. I don't feel like awakening is leading us more and more towards just sitting like potatoes on the sidelines while things unfold in their, material world duality. I think it's possible to embody both unified consciousness and human feeling, human emotion, genuine compassion, compassion that is active and that is informed by such an intelligence that it is not going to amplify or increase duality, increase conflict. And that perhaps is one of the better measures for whether or not we're responding to a situation from this place of deep present consciousness and beingness, is that the action we choose to take will diffuse suffering and diffuse conflict. Whether if we're taking an action which increases suffering or increases conflict, it is likely to be driven from other motivations. So that can be a way of sort of litmus testing as we go along. But, as for those of you who've done any reading of the Bhagavad Gita, we have this situation with Arjuna where he's just so confused about whether to take action or not. And he can see that transcendental element of being a yogi, and at the same time is torn by this sort of ethical considerations on the human level. And he keeps asking, like, but surely I shouldn't take action if I'm in this non-dual state, if I'm not seeing anyone as good or bad, if I'm no better than my opponents, then surely I shouldn't be taking any action. And what Krishna is essentially saying to Arjuna is that you're in the human realm, you have to take action. That's a part of the experience. And Ram Dass always referred to, I think it was Emmanuel was his friend that was always telling him, you're you've been given a curriculum, right? This is the human curriculum. So if you're at school, take the curriculum. And our curriculum is to take action and to experiment with that and to work towards a way of taking action that is harmonizing, rather than separating ourselves from action entirely. It's okay to mess it up because that's also a part of the human experience. It's okay to sometimes step into the field and work with the material of life in a way that we think is compassionate, and then later discover that perhaps there was some shadow parts of ourselves that were driving that. And that's a seeing, it's a awareness that arises, and then we modulate our next steps in order to reflect that wisdom that we've gained from the action. That is the curriculum of life. As kids, we know very little about how the world works. And then we grow into these adults who are perhaps even more confused about how the world works. But we just keep moving in the field with a mind to gradually harmonize things more and more. But that harmony is not the same as stepping out of the field entirely. Stepping out of the field entirely is a dissociation from our responsibility as human beings to embody awakening, to bring the unified consciousness which we've been graced to become aware of down into the human experience, not to fix anybody else, but simply because that is the gift that we've been given. These are my thoughts on equanimity. I'd love to hear